I learned early on that love had conditions. In my house, affection wasn't something you just received. It had to be earned, like a paycheck or a prize. My parents never told me they were proud, never hugged me just because they wanted to. Love was a transaction, and I was expected to perform. Straight A's? Barely acknowledged. A top-tier university? Just the minimum requirement. A high-paying job? Nothing less would do. I wasn't their daughter. I was their project, a means to an end. So, I worked. I pushed myself past exhaustion, chasing their approval like a desperate gambler chasing a winning streak. I met every demand, exceeded every expectation, and yet, it was never enough. If I made a mistake, even the smallest one, the warmth disappeared. The conversation stopped. The disappointment filled the air, thick and suffocating. I could feel it in their silence, in the way they looked past me like I was invisible. No words were needed. Their message was clear. Without perfection, I was nothing. But still, I hoped. Hoped that one day they'd see me for more than my achievements. That maybe, just maybe, they'd love me for who I was, not just for what I could give them. But hope is a cruel thing. It kept me trapped, making me believe in a future that would never come. And deep down, I knew it. No title, no paycheck, no trophy could fill the emptiness inside me. And yet, I stayed. I obeyed. Because if I wasn't their perfect daughter, then who was I? I remember the night staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with a question I was too afraid to ask out loud. Why wasn't I enough? I had done everything they wanted. Every decision, every sacrifice, every exhausting push forward had been for them. And yet their love remained just out of reach, like a locked door with no key. I convinced myself that if I just tried harder, if I just gave more, they'd finally open it. But the truth was, they never would. Love was supposed to be given freely, not held hostage. I saw other kids with parents who cherished them, who showed up to their school plays, who celebrated their birthdays with something more than a nod of obligation. And I told myself I didn't need that I was stronger because of it. But deep down, I envied them. Not for their achievements, but for the simple, effortless love they received just for existing. I lived in a house full of people, yet I had never felt so alone. Every conversation was about performance, every interaction a test I had to pass. If I was tired, I was lazy. If I was struggling, I wasn't trying hard enough. Emotions weren't acknowledged unless they served a purpose. Even sadness had to be productive. If I cried, I had to have a reason, a justification. Otherwise, it was weakness, something to be ignored or, worse, corrected. So I learned to bury it. To push it down so deep it couldn't surface, not even when I needed it to. Because in my parents' house, feelings had no value, only results did. I became an expert at pretending, smiling when I wanted to cry, nodding when I wanted to scream. For years, I played the role of the perfect daughter, convincing myself that if I performed well enough, they'd eventually see me. Not just as their achievement, but as a person. I told myself it was only a matter of time. One more milestone. One more sacrifice. Then finally, they'd love me the way I had always needed them to. But time passed, and nothing changed. Every success was met with indifference, every effort taken for granted. I won awards, received promotions, built a future they could brag about, and still, it wasn't enough. It never would be. And yet, despite everything, I still craved their approval. I still wanted to be told I mattered. I hated myself for it. For being that desperate, that dependent on something I knew I would never get. And the worst part? I didn't know how to stop wanting it. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how empty it left me, I kept coming back for more. It was pathetic, really, like a starving stray dog begging for scraps from a family that never wanted it in the first place. But things were about to change. I didn't know it yet, but soon, the truth would reveal itself. And when it did, it wouldn't just break me. It would awaken something else. Something I had never felt before. The truth came on an ordinary day, wrapped in the same cold indifference I had always known. No warning, no dramatic build-up, just a casual conversation that shattered everything. I had just reached another milestone, another achievement they could claim as their own. I had secured the kind of financial stability most people only dreamed of. And for the first time, they acted differently, warmer, almost affectionate. It was jarring, like watching strangers wearing my parents' faces. Then, the words came. Simple, blunt, unapologetic. We only had you so you could take care of us. A statement, not a confession. A fact they saw no reason to sugarcoat. My entire existence boiled down to a transaction. I wasn't their daughter, I was their investment. A long-term financial plan with a pulse. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, as they continued. Now it's time for you to repay us for everything we gave you. Repay them, as if love, care, and support had been a debt I owed. As if my entire childhood, every sleepless night, every anxious breakdown, every desperate attempt to be enough, had been part of some unspoken contract. And now, the bill had come due. I sat there, staring at them, waiting for something. An explanation, a hint of remorse, anything to soften the blow. But there was nothing. Just expectation in their eyes, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. As if I should have always known. My whole life, I had been grasping for their love, twisting myself into something they could be proud of, something worthy of their affection. And now, I realized it had never been about me. It had never been about love. Everything made sense now. The coldness, the pressure, the way my worth had always been measured in grades, salaries, and status. I was never a daughter to them. I was a means to an end. And now that I had finally arrived, they were ready to cash in. You should be grateful, my mother added, as if she were reminding me to say thank you for a gift I never asked for. We gave you everything. Everything? The word felt like a sick joke. I had given up my childhood, my peace, my sense of self just to please them. I had sacrificed friendships, joy, and any chance at real happiness because I thought, one day, it would all be worth it. That they would finally see me, finally love me, but they never had. They never would. And suddenly, something inside me cracked. Not sadness, not grief, something darker, something I had never felt before. The rage came slowly, curling around my chest like a tightening rope. It wasn't a burst of emotion. It was cold, steady, and absolute. I had spent my entire life chasing a mirage, believing that if I was perfect enough, I could make them love me. But they had never even seen me as a person. I was just a tool, a resource. And now, they expected me to step into my role, to serve them like some kind of dutiful investment finally paying off. I should have cried. I should have broken down. But there were no tears, just silence. Just the weight of understanding settling into my bones. They didn't even notice the change in me. They were too busy listing their expectations, how I'd cover their expenses, how I'd ensure their comfort, how it was my responsibility to take care of them. We sacrificed so much for you, my father said, shaking his head as if he were disappointed I hadn't immediately agreed. The least you can do is give back. The least I could do. I almost laughed. All these years, I had given them everything. My time, my energy, my very identity. And it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But for the first time, I wasn't the desperate little girl begging for their approval. No, that girl was gone. And in her place, something else had taken root. Something sharp. Something final. I smiled. Just a small, practiced smile. The same one I had used my whole life to make them believe I was obedient, compliant. But inside, I was already making plans. I nodded, letting them believe I had accepted my fate, that I understood my duty. I played my part well, just as I always had. I smiled at the right moments, asked the right questions. How much do you need? What kind of lifestyle were you hoping for? I made them think I was falling in line, that I was ready to become exactly what they wanted me to be. But inside, I was calculating. Every demand they made, every assumption they voiced, I filed it away. They had spent my entire life treating me like an investment. Well, now it was time for me to make some financial decisions of my own. I started small. A few adjustments here and there, subtle, careful. I reviewed every account, every asset they thought they had control over. They were careless, trusting that because they had raised me, I would never dare to turn against them. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming I still cared. They had spent a lifetime preparing me for success, molding me into someone who could navigate the world on their behalf. But in their greed, they had overlooked one crucial fact. I was smarter than them, and now I was the one in control. I didn't rush. Revenge, I realized, was best served slow. If I stripped them of everything overnight, they would see it coming. No, I needed them to feel secure, to believe they were finally getting what they deserved. So I played the role of the dutiful daughter. I nodded along as they talked about the house they wanted, the vacations they planned to take, on my dime, of course. They had no idea that with every passing day, I was tightening the noose. The first step was legal. I combed through every financial tie between us, every shared account, every document where their names appeared. Slowly, I made them disappear. I rerouted assets, dissolved connections, ensured that, on paper, they had nothing left to claim. If they ever tried to take from me, they would find themselves locked out, powerless. Next came their false sense of security. I made small deposits into their accounts, just enough to keep them complacent. They assumed more would come, that their golden years would be cushioned by my hard work. I watched them spend freely, completely unaware that the flow would soon stop. They had always assumed I was theirs to control, a resource they could tap into at will. They never realized that, this time, I was the one making the rules. The next step was more personal. I sold off what they thought was theirs. Assets they had assumed were untouchable. The house they once dreamed of passing down? Gone, under my name now, legally out of their reach. Their retirement funds? Drained, transferred, locked behind layers of legal protections they couldn't undo. Every financial safety net they had woven for themselves, every cushion they had planned to fall back on, I dismantled it, thread by thread. They still had no idea. They were too busy living in their fantasy, too arrogant to suspect that the daughter they had spent a lifetime controlling was quietly pulling the floor out from under them. I watched as they made plans, as they spoke about their future with the same entitlement they always had. And I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I was patient. The final step was ensuring they had nowhere to turn. I severed every remaining tie: insurance, credit, access to accounts. I left no loophole, no path back to me. By the time they noticed, it would be too late. The moment of reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, I would be there to watch. They had spent their lives believing I owed them something, but now they would learn what it felt like to have nothing at all. It started with a phone call. My mother's voice, sharp with frustration, demanded answers. "There's something wrong with our account. The bank is saying the funds are frozen." I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. She was used to instant obedience, to me scrambling to fix whatever problem they threw at me, but not this time. Then came my father. "What the hell is going on, Alyssa?" His voice was clipped, laced with the arrogance of a man who had never once considered the possibility of losing control. It must have been a shock, realizing that for the first time in his life, he had no power over me. I waited, let the panic build. Then, with deliberate calm, I spoke. "I don't know. Maybe you should call the bank." I heard my mother inhale sharply, caught between disbelief and fury. "Alyssa, fix this. Now." I smiled. "No." The silence on the other end was deafening. They weren't used to that word, not from me. And that's when the real desperation began. At first, they tried to intimidate me. My father's voice turned cold, clipped, like it always did when he wanted control. "Alyssa, I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to fix this, right now." As if I were a misbehaving child, as if his authority still meant something. I let out a small laugh, not forced, not calculated. A genuine, quiet amusement, at how predictable they were. Or what? I asked, tilting my head even though they couldn't see me. That threw them off. For a moment, neither spoke. I could imagine them exchanging glances, trying to figure out what had changed. I had spent my entire life bending to their will, chasing their approval. But now, I had nothing left to lose, and that terrified them. Then came the bargaining. My mother softened her tone, forced warmth into her voice like it was a script she was struggling to memorize. "Sweetheart, let's not make rash decisions. We're your family. We love you." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because if she truly loved me, even a fraction of what she claimed, she wouldn't have waited until now to say it. "You don't love me," I said, my voice steady. "You love what I could do for you." And for the first time in their lives, they had to face the truth. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I could almost hear their minds racing, scrambling for the right angle, the right manipulation to pull me back in. But they were running out of cards to play. Then, my father snapped. "Don't be ridiculous, Alyssa. We raised you. We gave you everything." His voice was sharp, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the anger beneath, the desperation. I sighed, leaning back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as if this conversation wasn't years in the making. "No, you didn't raise me. You managed me, groomed me. You shaped me into something useful, and now that I refuse to play my part, you don't know what to do." My mother whimpered something incoherent in the background, but I didn't care. I was done. I had spent years suffocating under the weight of their expectations, shrinking myself into the version of me they wanted. But now, they were the ones gasping for air. "Alyssa, please," my mother tried again, her voice trembling. "We're your parents. We're family." I closed my eyes. Family. That word had never meant what it should, but now it was just another chain I had broken. "No," I said, my voice final. "You're nothing to me." And then, before they could protest, before they could reach for another lie, I hung up. They called again, and again. Each time, I let it ring. Let them feel the panic, the helplessness, the creeping realization that no one was coming to save them. Then the messages started. First, demands. "Fix this now, Alyssa." Then threats. "You'll regret this. You think you're so smart, but you'll come crawling back." And finally, when all else failed, the begging. "Please, we have nothing. We'll lose everything. Don't do this to us." I read each one carefully, then deleted them. I had spent years waiting for something that would never come. Acknowledgement, love, even the barest sign of human decency. But they were never capable of it. I saw that now. The only reason they cared was because for the first time in their lives, they were powerless. And I was the one pulling the strings. Still, I wasn't done. Cutting them off financially wasn't enough. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be discarded, to be nothing. So I erased them. I started with their home, the one they assumed was theirs, the one they had bragged about retiring in, expecting me to foot the bills. They never thought to check the paperwork, never imagined that I had quietly transferred ownership months ago. When the eviction notice arrived, they must have thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. Next came their credit. They had always assumed financial ruin was something that happened to other people, irresponsible people. But they had been reckless, spending freely under the assumption that I would always be there to clean up their mess. So, I made sure they had no credit left to borrow against, no accounts they could tap into. Every lifeline, every backup plan, gone. Then, their reputation. My parents had spent their lives carefully curating an image, upstanding, successful, respected. I made sure that image crumbled. I let just enough truth slip to the right people, let whispers spread. Suddenly, friends they had relied on for favors and sympathy started pulling away. The invitations stopped. The polite smiles turned cold. They had always taught me that power meant control, that whoever held the money held the future. They were right. They just never thought I'd use those lessons against them. Then came the final blow. They had one last asset, A small sum of money they had squirreled away, something they had never mentioned to me, assuming I wouldn't notice. But I knew them too well. Their greed, their selfishness, their need to control, it made them predictable. I tracked it down, and legally, methodically, I took it. Every last cent. The next time they called, their voices were unrecognizable. No more threats, no more anger, just broken, pitiful desperation. My mother sobbed, her words barely coherent. "Please, Alyssa, we have nothing. Just help us a little, just until we get back on our feet." I let her cry. Let her feel the same hopelessness I had felt my entire life. Then finally I spoke. "You taught me that love is earned, remember?" My voice was calm, even. "You never earned mine." More sobbing, more pleading. My father tried one last time, his voice raw. "We're still your parents. You can't just abandon us." I smiled to myself. "You wanted a retirement plan," I said, my voice devoid of warmth. "Too bad I was never your daughter." And with that, I hung up for the last time. The silence was absolute. No more calls, no more messages, just nothing. I had erased them from my life, and in doing so, I had erased the last chains that bound me. It was strange, the way freedom felt. Not light or joyous, but clean, sterile, like stepping out of a storm into crisp, cold air. I changed my last name first, a clean cut, removing the last remnants of their hold over me. Then, I burned the photos, deleted every trace of them from my world. Old emails, childhood memories, gone. They had spent my entire life treating me like a transaction, a means to an end. Now, I was the one deciding their worth, and they were worth nothing. I never checked on them. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what had happened. They were penniless, abandoned by the very people they had once courted. I could imagine it. My father, defeated, forced to rely on distant relatives who had never liked him. My mother, humiliated, realizing too late that manipulation only worked when you still had something to offer. They had wanted me to suffer for them. Instead, they were the ones suffering. I didn't feel guilt. That was the most surprising part. I had expected some flicker of hesitation, some lingering voice whispering that I had gone too far. But there was nothing. Just a deep, quiet satisfaction. They had always taught me that love was conditional, that kindness was something you had to earn. But the truth was, they had never deserved mine. Every cold shoulder, every guilt trip, every moment of calculated neglect, they had built this ending brick by brick. And now they were left with nothing but the weight of their own cruelty. I imagined them searching for me, dialing numbers that would never connect, knocking on doors that would never open. My mother, hunched over in some borrowed guest room, whispering to herself that it wasn't supposed to be like this. My father, stewing in silent rage, knowing there was no one left to control. I sat in my new home, mine, completely mine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. A glass of wine rested in my hand, the weight of it grounding me in this moment, in this life I had built for myself. No more expectations, no more obligations, no more looking over my shoulder, waiting for their approval like a starving dog. The phone buzzed. An unknown number. I didn't have to check. I knew exactly who it was. Desperate, clinging to the last sliver of hope that I might still care, that I might still be the obedient daughter who would fix everything for them. I smiled. Not out of joy, not out of cruelty, just finality. The same way one might smile when shutting a door for the last time. With a single motion, I deleted the call, erasing them as easily as they had once erased me. I leaned back, letting out a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. The past was gone. The chains were broken,